Times Network brought together activists, business leaders, policy makers and everyday citizens in its inaugural India Climate Summit to address the impact of climate change. These distinguished voices have championed the cause of climate action. They have been raising awareness and protecting the future of our planet. The summit brought forth its commitment to foster a sustainable nation, uniting stakeholders in a common agenda. Arun Sharma, Group Head for Sustainability and Climate Change and advisor to the Chairman of Adani Group, joined in an interesting conversation to discuss green energy potential and will the future see renewables revolution.
Distinguished guests and our esteemed speakers, welcome to the India Climate Summit. When it comes to with the special session that is on unleashing the green energy, the renewable revolution, we are honored to have Mr. Arun Sharma, the Group Head for Sustainability and Climate Change and advisor to the Chairman of the Adani Group among us.
Please both join us by gracing the stage. It's an honor to have you among us. This is a high caliber gathering and your insights will prove to be invaluable. Mr. Arun Sharma is among us and Dipti, the floor is yours. We look forward to an engaging discussion.
Thank you so much. If I may begin by asking you that, what according to you is climate change in today's day and time? How real is this danger? Are we as a country and as a world community even aware of the real dangers, and how close are those dangers right at our doorstep?
Climate change is the defining subject of our times. It is real, it is happening, the scientific evidence is overwhelming, and we are looking at the impact in terms of very hot summers, frequent cyclones, droughts, and we cannot ignore it. I think India is doing more than its fair share to address the impact of climate change. The minister rightly pointed out to some simple facts. The Indian economy is growing at more than 7%, but its emissions are only growing at 4%. So the emission intensity of the economy is reducing faster than the economy is growing. One has to understand, India did not cause this problem. It was caused by the emissions of the Western countries, developed economies, and India has to deal with it, but it has to deal in a way that is fair and just to its population, but at the same time, do it in a responsible way. And I think in all this debate about climate change, we become fixated on many things. And I think one has to realize that the ultimate goal that will address this is reduction of emissions. Reduction of emissions is the most important. And how do you do that? You transition to renewable energy, you transition to energy storage solutions that are green, and then ensure that our demand doesn't grow as fast as the Western standard of living.
I do remember the Prime Minister from the ramparts of the Red Fort speaking about the green hydrogen mission. We do know what happened when you had Nitin Gadkari who drove into the parliament in that hydrogen car. So that's exactly, I think, how people identify the conversation around green hydrogen, sir. But what really is green hydrogen? How is it different from the other options that not just we as a country are looking at, but even the world is looking at? And in simple layman terms, what is the ability or what is the capacity of green hydrogen? Where do you place this in this entire climate change conversation?
India has to decarbonize its grid. India has no choice but to use coal for much of its baseload powers for decades, because India cannot afford imported LNG for electricity production. The cost will be twice in terms of energy. India has hydroelectric power. Pumped storage is something that will help. But again, there are limits to how much you can do because the ecological damage also has to be taken into account. Nuclear is an option, but India doesn't have uranium. So no matter what you do, you are reliant on thermal power for a while. So what India has rightly done is focused on renewables. And it is an amazing achievement. Today, India is among the world's lowest producer of solar power that we can see. And it actually has to be the leadership of the Prime Minister and the corporate sector has risen up to the challenge. Wind is also growing, but the problem with renewables is that it is intermittent. We need energy storage solutions. Pumped storage will play. Fortunately, because of overcapacity in China, batteries are coming down in price. But ultimately for India, green hydrogen is going to be the solution for decarbonization.
Whenever there is something new that we are looking at, clearly there are a lot of challenges. You're looking at the cost factor, the storage, the production, a lot more. Today, which is that one country, if Germany you believe is that country, because it did started a lot of experiment with green hydrogen, where all it can be used, which are the sectors that you will see it abundantly being used in the future? And vis-a-vis India, how does that also change our position when it comes to the world over and the commitments India has also made when it comes to the Paris Pact?
Hydrogen is hydrogen. Once you have produced hydrogen, whether from coal, from natural gas, or from electrolysis of water using renewable energy, we have been using hydrogen for a long time. We produce ammonia using hydrogen that actually is responsible for making fertilizers. We use hydrogen in petrochemical refineries. So hydrogen is nothing new. We have been dealing with it. What is new is that we have to produce it in a way that it is cost effective and it's green. And so India is better positioned for green hydrogen, but there seems to be a major push to say, oh, green hydrogen is expensive. A lot of this opposition is coming from natural gas producers because green hydrogen is a threat to natural gas. India does not produce a lot of natural gas, so India will succeed because there is not going to be much opposition inside the country. Now, you talked about which are the sectors. Fertilizers. India is the largest consumer of fertilizers in the world. Most of it is imported, the ammonia required to produce. So the first thing will be you decarbonize the fertilizer sector by taking the high emission ammonia and converting that to green ammonia, which is made from green hydrogen. Refining uses hydrogen, right now gray hydrogen, which is from natural gas, 9 kilograms per kilogram of the intensity. You can use green hydrogen for the refining purposes. As you know, Adani Group and Wilmar have vegetable oil production. It also uses gray hydrogen for the hydrogenation. You can use that. But ultimately, what green hydrogen allows you to do is decarbonize hard-to-abate sectors like steel and even cement, which I can touch upon, because that's also needed for India. So without hydrogen, there is no net zero for India.
Do we have any examples or prototypes the world around that perhaps India can emulate? When you talk of green hydrogen, its production, its usage, any countries that perhaps we can get inspired?
The story of green hydrogen is fairly new. Countries like Norway have been producing green hydrogen for several decades, but they use hydroelectric power. The technology, the electrolyzers, has been there for 100 years. There's nothing new about it. But what we are talking about is using solar and wind to produce green hydrogen, and India will lead the way. Because for most countries, I live in Australia. Australia is one of the largest energy exporters, thermal coal, LNG, and eventually it will be a player in green hydrogen. But they have to worry about the revenues that come from export of traditional things. Middle East is exporting oil and natural gas, but they can also play a role in green hydrogen. Whereas for India, green hydrogen is it, if India wants energy security. So you will see that the corporate sector in India is really caught onto this opportunity, whether it is Reliance or Adani or Renew or Acme. They're all working and they see this as a great opportunity, not only for India to decarbonize, but to become a green energy exporter. And India has to lead the way because the technology, there is hardly anything that is rocket science. It is a question of execution, execution, execution.
There's this interesting figure that I was looking at with the Adani Green Energy that plans to reach an installed capacity of 45 gigawatts by 2030. And that is essentially going to be 10%, I think, of India's total renewable energy target. But you also have Moody's ratings that recently said, spoke about the kind of money that India might need in case it wants to reach that milestone. So when you see that entire difference in the expectations, the money that we require, do you think that that target could face any obstacles?
It will require a lot of investment, and that investment will come from international sources. And yes, there can be challenges initially, but I think the tide is about to turn. And let me try to explain why this will happen. If you look at energy transition in Western countries, there is a lot of money to invest. But in the US, if you want to get a solar farm set up, it takes you 2 years to get the permitting done. For onshore wind, it can be 6 years. For offshore wind, it is 12 years. That's very close to nuclear. Even if you produce your solar and wind farms, there is no transmission line. So you're waiting for transmission line for the things to be evacuated. So there are so many problems facing Western countries in ramping up some of these renewable projects. And largely it is because the NIMBY phenomena, not in my backyard. People don't want transmission lines in their backyard. And this is where India has been extremely well positioned. The policies in terms of permitting, the land, making land available that doesn't have any other uses, making sure that there is a strategy around transmission lines is important. So let me give you an example. And by the way, our target now is 50 gigawatt by 2030. So in Khavda, in Gujarat, it's a land that has no other use. Saline land, the nearest community is 80 kilometers. We are building a 30 gigawatt renewable park. Now, even before a single electron was fired, the transmission line connecting it to the national grid, a 108-kilometer transmission line, was ready. This is unheard of in Western countries. So people are eventually going to see that India has demonstrated the ramp-up of renewables, and these are good investment opportunities, and the Indian private sector is there to take that. But let me make another simple point here. International finance is trying to basically be good. They're trying to look at ESG matters. But they're wasting their time on 30 different parameters of ESG, where most of those things like human rights and workplace, diversity, they're all part of the regulatory framework. Now, if you look at India's emission intensity, for every $1 trillion of GDP, currently India has around 780 million tons of carbon dioxide. The figure for China is 590 million tons. For the United States, it is 190 million tons. And for European Union, it's 160 million tons. Now, the easiest way to do something for the climate is to reduce the emission intensity of the Indian grid by funding renewable projects in India, rather than wasting everyone's time with playing games around ESG. And this is something that the Western financial institutions have to understand, that if you don't do this, then India, despite trying hard, will not be able to ramp up its reduction of emission intensity as it should, not only for its own sake, but for the world's sake.
One issue that is very relatable, and one of our viewers has asked us this question. This is about the entire conversation of hydrogen cars, Hydrogen cars, could there be a reality in the country?
One has to understand that there are two kinds of hydrogen cars or hydrogen vehicles. One is you can actually use green hydrogen in the internal combustion engine. And the other one is you can use green hydrogen in the fuel cell. And the difference between the two is if you use green hydrogen in the internal combustion engine with slight modification, it's just like the normal car. But if you use fuel cell, then the drivetrain has to be electric. What basically means is that an electric vehicle in the future can take the battery out and you can replace it by hydrogen fuel cell, and that becomes a hydrogen car. Batteries make a lot of sense because they convert almost 85% of the electricity into sort of like, the energy that is used in propelling a vehicle. In hydrogen, there is a lot of, loss. First you use renewable, then you lose half of it in producing green hydrogen, and then the fuel cell loses another half. And that appears to be like, why are you doing it? Well, the reason is that in the middle of the day, the cost of solar can almost be zero, okay? So that's a brute force approach. But the challenge with battery electric vehicles is it works for countries where everyone has a parking slot in in their homes, and overnight it can be charged. If you look at the charging times, unfortunately charging times are coming down, still you have to take into account parking time while charging in real estate constrained cities like in India. And so it is useful to do it, but powering it purely on solar and all that will require other energy storage solution. But the bigger challenge is when you go to heavy duty vehicles, the trucks, the weight of the battery becomes prohibitive. While charging times, there is progress happening, the weight of the battery is not coming down. And this is where hydrogen fuel cells in the future will work. Now, one of the challenges with hydrogen is that there is no infrastructure for supplying hydrogen. So what will likely happen is for heavy-duty trucks and buses, you build the infrastructure. But once you build the infrastructure, people might move from battery electric vehicles to hydrogen car because a Toyota Mirai, which is a hydrogen car, on 1 kilogram of hydrogen can go for 100 kilometers. So a 10 kilogram tank of hydrogen has a range of 1,000 kilometers, which you cannot imagine on battery electric vehicle.
How soon could a common man start using green hydrogen, and in what ways?
Yeah. Hydrogen for transportation will first happen for heavy duty vehicles. It's not going to happen for, at least in India, it's not going to happen for small cars that you and I drive. What is needed is the infrastructure. So far as the fuel cost is concerned, it's already in the money. I think in India, we can produce green hydrogen at $3 a kilogram, which is equivalent to, say, 3 kilograms of diesel. So it's not that far off. The challenge is the delivered cost of hydrogen is high because the infrastructure doesn't exist. So we have commissioned a hydrogen logistics trucks for our mines that Ashok Leyland and Ballard Fuel Cell has built, which we hope to trial. Okay? And obviously, we have to try that. So as the government comes up with policy for heavy-duty transportation to move to hydrogen, then the infrastructure will be built. And once the infrastructure built, you will see that it will become a more widely accepted form. But because of the energy conversion factors I have said, battery electric vehicles make sense for small to medium small to medium sort of transportation vehicles.
Pushing, the entire concept of the government's intervention in this idea, and the Prime Minister speaking of the green hydrogen mission, saying that we'll become a hub by 2030. Is that a realistic target we are looking at?
This will happen. Okay, this will happen because when I look at what the Indian private sector is doing, and I'm not just talking about the Adani Group, there is a real excitement. And let me tell you why it will happen. Okay, it will happen because of the domestic demand, but also the international demand for hydrogen. So obviously the domestic demand will be for decarbonization of fertilizers and refining to begin with. And the government will come up with, already for refining, there is a policy. For fertilizers, we are likely to see a policy, and that will happen. Another domestic demand in the 2030s will be that one way to decarbonize thermal power is by adding ammonia into the mix with coal. Japan has already demonstrated this technology. We are actually piloting it. So if you add 20% ammonia, and if that ammonia is green ammonia that has been produced by using green hydrogen, then you are reducing the emissions by 20%. And in some ways, if you are importing the LNG from, say, United States, then the upstream emission, the cooling and transportation is the same emission, like, by thermal power with 20% ammonia and the LNG from the US. So that will create in 2030s further domestic demand. But the most exciting thing is the demand from international markets. Europe has decided that it is only going to use green hydrogen. Okay. What it means is that it will import hydrogen because it doesn't have enough land for renewable energy. And the only cost-effective way to transport hydrogen to Europe is by converting it into ammonia, and then on the other side, cracking the ammonia to get hydrogen. So they have already signed one deal. Total and Air Products has signed for delivery. Okay, this creates an export opportunity. And Japan has decided to use ammonia as a fuel, and we are trying to basically say, import green ammonia for your fuel from India. So it creates an opportunity. Now, the reason why India is ahead in this game is we have reduced the cost of renewable energy. We are going to build our own electrolyzers. But the most important thing is ammonia is not an easy chemical to handle. You have to maintain safety. It turns out that more than half of the human capital that is certified to deal with ammonia actually is in India, because India has one of the largest fertilizer consumptions in the world where it is there. So there are a lot of factors which will go in making India a green hydrogen hub. And that, I think, is a great opportunity.
It's been a fascinating conversation. I, for sure, have learned a lot. So I'm sure we've all gained in experience and insight in the future. The road ahead, sir. As always, a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much.